5 centuries ago, 3 children climbed into the thin air of the Andes and never returned. Their lives ended, yet cold, height and silence protected their bodies so carefully that time seemed to stop around them. The mountain preserved what the living world was meant to lose. Who were these 3 frozen children? Why were they sacrificed? And how did they remain almost unchanged for 500 years? Long before the 3 children were found, the mountain had already been keeping them in a place where ordinary human life becomes difficult to sustain. Llullaillaco rises from the high Andes near the border of present-day Argentina and Chile, surrounded by dry land, thin air, strong winds, and temperatures that can fall far below what the human body can comfortably endure. At lower elevations, people can still find valleys, grazing land, water, and settlements. But higher on the mountain, each step moves farther from the conditions in which human communities normally live. The air contains less oxygen, breathing becomes harder, movement slows, and the body must work more carefully simply to remain warm and alert. Yet 5 centuries ago, people carried children, food, textiles, wooden objects, small figures, and ceremonial materials toward this remote summit. They did not arrive by accident, and they were not wandering without direction. Stone structures, paths, shelters, and a ceremonial platform show that the ascent had been planned, organized, and repeated with purpose. This is the first quiet fact that makes Llullaillaco difficult to understand. The mountain appears almost empty, but human hands had shaped a route into its silence. Someone chose where to stop, where to build, where to place supplies, and where the final ceremony would take place. The effort required was not small. Those who climbed had to move through cold, wind, fatigue, and the growing effects of altitude, while carrying materials that had value far below. The mountain, therefore, became more than a landscape. It became a boundary between ordinary life and a place set apart from it. People had lived in the Andes for thousands of years before the Inca state expanded across the region, and generations had learned how to survive in high valleys, how to travel across difficult terrain, and how to understand the changing conditions of elevation. But Llullaillaco demanded something beyond daily adaptation. Near the summit, there was almost no reason to remain for food, shelter, farming, or family life. The journey made sense only because the mountain held a meaning powerful enough to justify the danger. The 3 children were brought into a space where the environment itself seemed to remove them from the world below. Their final resting place was not hidden in a city, not placed beside a road used every day, and not marked by a monument visible to crowds. It was set high above settlements, in a region of cold soil and dry air where few people would ever return. This distance helped preserve the bodies, but preservation was not the purpose that can be proven from the environment alone. Cold can explain why soft tissue survived, yet it cannot explain why the children were selected, why particular objects accompanied them, or why the ceremony was carried so close to the sky. To approach those questions honestly, the mountain must first be seen as both a physical place and a human decision. Its height affected breathing, movement, and survival, while its remoteness gave the ceremony a separation that ordinary ground could not provide. Every stone wall near the summit records labor, every path records intention, and every object carried upward connects the frozen children to the organized society that sent them there. The mystery does not begin with the moment they died. It begins much earlier, when people looked toward one of the highest and harshest places in their world and decided that 3 young lives, carefully prepared and accompanied, should be taken there before any explanation of ritual, empire, or belief can be considered. The ascent itself must be understood as evidence, because it joined the limits of the human body with the intentions of a society, and it placed the children where nature would slow, decay, erase traces of time, and leave future generations facing a scene that feels near, although the world that created it is gone. In February and March of 1999, a scientific expedition climbed Llullaillaco with a question already shaped by earlier discoveries across the Andes. Could the highest slopes still hold traces of Inca ceremonies that had survived beyond ordinary reach? The team moved through a landscape where every action had to be slow, because thin air weakens the body and cold changes the way tools, hands, and judgment work. Near the summit, They encountered remains of an organized sacred complex rather than a random shelter. There were pathways, stone constructions, places for rest, and a ceremonial platform built where few people could remain for long. The structures showed that those who came 5 centuries earlier had not simply reached the mountain, they had prepared it for a deliberate event. Excavation therefore began with care, since disturbed soil, a broken textile, or a displaced object could erase relationships that had remained intact for centuries. Beneath the platform, the archaeologists uncovered separate burial spaces, and within them appeared the bodies of 3 children, each placed with clothing and offerings that still held colour, texture, and recognizable form. The first impression was not like opening an ordinary grave, because cold and dryness had preserved skin, hair, garments, feathers, wood, shell, metal, and woven fibres with an unusual degree of clarity. One child was an older girl, now commonly called the Maiden. Another was a younger girl, later known as the Lightning Girl. And the third was a boy. These names were created by modern observers. Because the names used during their lives have not survived, their positions and belongings differed, yet all 3 were connected by the same carefully constructed high mountain setting. Around them were miniature human and animal figures, textiles, vessels, food, and other objects associated with Inca ceremonial practice. Nothing in the arrangement suggested a sudden disaster or an accidental death during travel. The chambers had been prepared, the offerings had been selected, and the children had been placed in ways that followed an intentional order. Even so, discovery did not provide an immediate explanation. Archaeology can reveal where an object rested and how one deposit relates to another, but it cannot recover a spoken instruction or a child's private fear. The excavators had to record the evidence before interpretation could begin. Photographs, drawings, measurements, soil observations, and the position of every item became essential, because once the bodies were removed, the original setting could never be recreated exactly. This discipline linked the discovery to the deeper human past of the Andes, where communities had lived with high mountains for many generations, and where the Inca later joined distant regions through roads, labor, ritual, and political authority. The summit platform was therefore not only a grave, it was the final point in a chain of human decisions extending from settlements far below to one of the most difficult places a child could be taken. The mountain had protected the scene through conditions that would normally threaten life, but those same conditions made recovery dangerous. Since exposed tissue and organic materials could change when brought into warmer air, every movement, therefore, carried 2 responsibilities: preserving information and treating the children not as objects found in ice, but as beings whose deaths required restraint. The children were eventually transported under controlled conditions so that rapid warming would not destroy what the mountain had preserved. Their removal changed them from hidden presences into subjects of science, public memory, and ethical debate. Yet the excavation itself left a quieter lesson. The most remarkable feature was not simply that 3 bodies survived, but that an entire ceremonial arrangement remained legible enough to show intention without revealing every motive. The platform gave evidence of planning, the offerings gave evidence of value, and the bodies gave evidence of young lives brought to the summit, while the central reason for that journey still waited beyond the first moment of discovery. When the 3 children were first revealed beneath the frozen ground, the most unsettling fact was not that they had died, because death is common in archaeology, but that they still appeared to occupy a human presence that time had not fully erased. Skin remained over their faces, hair still followed the shape in which it had been arranged, clothing still folded around their bodies, and small details that usually disappear within years had survived for roughly 5 centuries. This preservation created an unusual distance between knowledge and emotion. The evidence was ancient, yet the bodies did not look distant in the way dry bones often do. They seemed close enough to remind observers that each child had once breathed, eaten, walked, and felt the cold of the mountain. The maiden sat with her head lowered, her long hair carefully styled, and her clothing still carrying the signs of ceremonial preparation. The younger girl showed changes caused by lightning after burial, yet much of her body and clothing remained protected, while the boy was found wrapped and positioned with objects that connected him to the same organized event. Each body preserved a different history, and together they formed a record more immediate than the stone walls surrounding them. Cold slowed the chemical reactions that normally break tissue down. Dry air reduced moisture, frozen soil limited the movement of insects and microorganisms, and the thin atmosphere created conditions in which decay could proceed only slowly. But none of these natural forces acted alone. The burial spaces also shielded the children from wind, sunlight, animals, and repeated human disturbance. The mountain therefore became an accidental archive, preserving not only bodies but relationships between bodies, clothing, food, vessels, figures, and the architecture around them. This was not perfect preservation in a literal sense, because tissues had changed. One child had been affected by lightning, and all three required careful control after removal from the summit. Yet the survival was complete enough for scientists to examine teeth, bones, internal organs, hair, and traces of diet without reducing the children to skeletons. The human beginning of this story remains important, because preservation can easily turn a person into a spectacle, especially when the face is still visible. But the children did not become meaningful only when they were found. Their meaning began within families and communities far below the summit, before the journey, before the burial, and before the mountain made their bodies resistant to time. Archaeology can study growth, health, clothing, food, and the order in which objects were placed, but it cannot recover the sound of their names, the voices of those who knew them, or the exact words spoken during the ceremony. This is the central limit hidden inside the remarkable discovery. The mountain saved physical detail while allowing personal memory to vanish. It kept strands of hair but not a conversation, facial features but not an expression explained by context, stomach contents but not the meaning of the final meal, and clothing but not the hands that dressed them. Their bodies therefore seem to offer answers while continually returning the investigator to uncertainty. Even modern imaging does not transform that boundary into certainty, because a scan can reveal an organ, an injury, or a pattern of growth, yet it cannot tell whether a child understood the destination, accepted the ceremony, resisted it, or had been given any choice by the adults and institutions surrounding the journey. They show that the final event was deliberate, that preparation occurred, and that the children were treated as important within the ceremony, but they do not yet explain why a powerful society believed the journey was necessary. The silence surrounding them is not empty. It is filled with evidence that must be interpreted slowly, because every preserved detail can support careful knowledge, while every missing voice creates a boundary that honest history should not cross. 5 centuries ago, before Spanish forces entered the central Andes, the 3 children belonged to a world governed by Tawantinsuyu, the Inca state whose name is often translated as the realm of the 4 parts. It was not a single people living in one uniform culture, but a vast political order that joined many communities, languages, landscapes, and older traditions under the authority centered in Cusco. High valleys, coastal deserts, farming terraces, forests, and cold plateaus were connected through obligations that moved labor, food, textiles, animals, and information across long distances. The state depended less on markets or coined money than on carefully organized work, storage, redistribution, and relationships between local leaders and imperial officials. Families continued to live within communities that had their own histories, while the Inca government asked those communities to provide labor for roads, fields, military service, buildings, herds, and ceremonies. This system could support travelers and armies, but it also carried the demands of power into ordinary life. Storehouses held maize, potatoes, dried meat, cloth, tools, and other supplies, allowing officials to move resources toward places where they were needed. Runners carried spoken messages and knotted records were used to preserve accounts. Yet much about administration remains uncertain because the Inca did not leave alphabetic histories describing their institutions in their own words. Most written descriptions came later, through colonial observers whose reports must be compared with archaeology. Oral tradition, architecture, textiles, and surviving landscapes. This caution matters when approaching the children of Llullaillaco, because they were not members of an abstract empire. They were young people born into communities that existed before the final mountain journey. Their food, clothing, hair, and bodies began to record their lives long before they were selected for any ceremony. The human starting point was therefore local, in households where children learned language, work, kinship, and the rhythms of a particular environment. Only later did the larger state reach into those lives, perhaps through officials, religious authorities, or local leaders, and transform individual children into participants in an event that connected distant communities with Cusco and with a sacred mountain. Tawantinsuyu expanded rapidly during the generations before European arrival, often building upon systems already developed by earlier Andean societies. It adapted existing roads, farming methods, forms of labor, and sacred places rather than creating an entirely new world from empty land. Incorporation could involve alliance, negotiation, marriage, exchange, political pressure, or armed force, and different regions experienced Inca authority in different ways. This variety prevents any simple picture of every subject living under identical conditions. Some local elites gained status through cooperation, while some communities faced heavier demands, relocation, or conflict. At the center stood the ruler, and a hierarchy of nobles, priests, administrators, and specialists. But the strength of the state depended on the work of many people whose names were never recorded. Farmers raised crops at difficult elevations, herders cared for llamas and alpacas, weavers produced fine cloth, builders shaped stone and earth, and messengers crossed steep terrain. The world that carried the three children toward Llullaillaco was created by these accumulated human efforts, not by a single command alone. Its power rested in the ability to coordinate people and resources across geography, to make a distant mountain accessible, and to give a ceremony performed there meaning within a much larger order. For those living within Tawantinsuyu, authority was experienced through seasons of planting, communal work, tribute obligations, festivals, and decisions made by leaders near and far. Imperial power was therefore not only visible in palaces or armies, it entered daily time, asking households to contribute bodies, skills, and goods to purposes larger than themselves. Within the wider state, understanding that world does not yet explain why the children died, but it shows that their final journey emerged from a society capable of combining belief, administration, labor, and political authority into one deliberate movement toward the summit. To understand how three children could be carried from settled valleys toward Llullaillaco, it is necessary to follow the roads that made distant places feel connected. The Capacocha was not one narrow trail but a broad network formed over many generations. Some routes existed before Inca expansion, while others were repaired, extended, or reorganized. When Tawantinsuyu grew across the Andes, these roads crossed environments that seem almost impossible to unite. Coastal deserts without reliable water, steep mountain passes, fertile valleys, high grasslands, and cold plateaus where breathing becomes difficult. Stone paving appeared where the ground required it. Retaining walls supported unstable slopes, steps climbed sharp inclines, bridges crossed rivers and ravines, and simple paths continued where elaborate construction was unnecessary. The system did not erase geography. It adjusted to it, and generation kerame, allowing human movement to continue through landscapes that demanded different skills at every elevation. People travelled on foot, while llamas carried loads suited to their strength and the narrow mountain routes. Resting places and storehouses supported journeys by holding food, textiles, tools, and other supplies. Messengers moved information between administrative centres, and officials could send instructions far beyond the places where those decisions began. This network gave the Inca state a practical way to coordinate labor and ceremony, but it also depended on knowledge accumulated by local communities. Because no central authority could create safe movement across the Andes without people who understood water sources, seasonal cold grazing areas, and the condition of each path. The roads were therefore both instruments of government and records of older human adaptation. Their beginning lay in ordinary movement, in families walking between fields, herders guiding animals, traders carrying useful goods, and communities maintaining paths that connected one generation with another. Imperial power expanded these habits into a larger structure, turning familiar routes into channels through which obligations, resources, soldiers, sacred objects, and selected people could travel. The three children belonged within this human system before they entered the preserved mountain record itself. They may have moved along more than one kind of route, passing through populated valleys and ceremonial centres before approaching the harsher southern highlands. Archaeology cannot reconstruct every stopping place, and no surviving itinerary gives a complete account of their journey. Yet the existence of roads and associated structures makes such organised movement understandable without imagining impossible travel through untouched wilderness. Llullaillaco itself contains archaeological remains linked by a route rising from lower areas towards structures near the summit, showing that the final ascent continued the same principle on a smaller and more severe scale. Movement was prepared through knowledge, labour, and places made for temporary shelter. As elevation increased, however, the road no longer served farming, exchange, or ordinary communication. It narrowed toward a destination chosen for ritual meaning. The children were being carried beyond the useful world supported by villages and storehouses, into a region where every breath required more effort and where supplies could not easily be replaced. This change reveals how the road joined political organization with the limits of the body. The state could command a journey, communities could provide labor and materials, and experienced travelers could guide the ascent. But none of these powers removed cold, exhaustion, thirst, or thin air. Many stretches have disappeared beneath later roads, erosion, farming, and modern borders. So the surviving network is only a fragment of what travelers once knew. But the remaining paths still reveal a landscape organized through repeated movement, practical knowledge, local memory, and carefully directed labor. The road only made endurance possible for a limited time. Its stones did not explain why the children were chosen, yet they show that their arrival was not an isolated act. It was the final movement of a connected society capable of carrying human intention across immense distance, from inhabited ground toward a summit where ordinary roads, ordinary duties, and eventually ordinary life came to a quiet stop. Llullaillaco stood within the southern reaches of Tawantinsuyu, far from Cusco but not outside the political and ceremonial world directed from the Inca capital. The mountain rises near the modern border between Argentina and Chile. Although no such national boundary existed when the three children were taken upward, the surrounding deserts, salt flats, high valleys, and volcanic peaks formed a demanding landscape inhabited and travelled by Andean communities long before Inca expansion reached the region. These communities already possessed knowledge of water, seasonal movement, herding, exchange, and sacred places, so the arrival of Inca authority did not create human life in an empty land. Instead, it entered older landscapes and joined them to a wider system of government, roads, labour, and ritual. The Southern Territory was often associated with Quilasuyu, one of the four great divisions through which the Inca understood their realm. But this broad name concealed considerable diversity. Different peoples spoke different languages, maintained local customs, and remembered their own ancestors. Some communities cooperated with imperial officials, some negotiated for advantage, and others may have experienced pressure or resistance. Archaeology rarely allows one simple account to describe them all. What can be seen more clearly is that the Inca state established administrative places, improved routes, moved resources, and recognized selected mountains as locations where imperial ceremonies could connect distant regions with Cusco. Llullaillaco became important within this meeting of local geography and expanding power. Its height made it visible across a wide area, while its summit offered a place removed from farming, homes, and ordinary social life. Yet the mountain was not merely seized and given meaning by outsiders. Andean reverence for powerful features of the landscape had deep roots, and local understandings may have shaped how the site was approached. The precise relationship between earlier beliefs and the later Inca ceremony cannot be reconstructed completely, so it is safer to see the sanctuary as a place where traditions, authority, and landscape converged, rather than as the product of a single idea imposed without change. The three children entered this southern world through a chain of human relationships. They did not move from the center of an empire directly into empty wilderness. They passed through lands, worked, remembered, and interpreted by generations of people. Guides knew the routes, laborers maintained facilities, herders and farmers supported movement. And officials could draw these local efforts into a ceremony whose meaning reached beyond one community. This connection returns the story to its human beginning, because the mountain journey depended on many unnamed adults before it enclosed 3 young lives. The final platform near the summit was linked to political organization far away, but every stone carried upward required hands close to the mountain. Imperial command and local knowledge therefore met in the same cold ground. The objects buried beside the children strengthen this picture. Their varied materials and careful workmanship represented relationships extending across different regions of the Inca world. Miniature figures, textiles, feathers, metals, shells, and vessels gathered distant environments into one ceremonial arrangement. The offerings made the summit a small image of a much larger society, while the children themselves became the most valuable and irreversible element within it. None of this proves that every local person understood the ceremony in the same way, nor does it reveal whether families experienced selection as honor, obligation, grief, coercion, or some combination that changed with circumstance. Later colonial reports describe ideals surrounding such offerings, but they were written after conquest and must not be treated as direct access to every earlier experience. Llullaillaco, therefore, marks neither a simple frontier nor an isolated grave. It records the point where an expanding state reached into a populated landscape, used roads and labor to approach a sacred height, and joined children from the living world below to a political and religious order stretching across the Andes, near the far southern limits of imperial power. Across the Andes, a mountain could be understood as more than stone rising above the land. It could be a presence within the human world, connected to water, weather, fertility, ancestry, danger, and the order of community life. This did not mean that every Andean people held one identical belief, because the region contained many languages, traditions, and local histories. Yet, archaeology and later records show that prominent peaks, springs, caves, rocks, and other features of the landscape often carried meanings that ordinary ground did not. Such places could receive offerings, mark boundaries, protect communities, or become points where people approach powers believed to influence life below. The mountain was therefore not separated from society. It stood within a network of obligations and memory. Families depended on snow and rain that descended from high elevations. Farmers watched the movement of clouds and seasons. Herders followed paths shaped by water and pasture, and travelers learned which places demanded caution or respect. These relationships began long before the Inca expanded across the Andes, because human survival in this environment required close attention to land, altitude, and changing weather. Through many generations, people learned that a distant summit could affect fields and animals far below through the water it stored and released. Practical dependence and sacred meaning were not necessarily opposing ideas. The same peak could be physically dangerous, economically important, and spiritually powerful. When Tawantinsuyu incorporated new territories, Inca authorities often worked within these older landscapes, rather than treating them as empty spaces. They recognized certain mountains, built paths and structures, and connected local sacred geography to ceremonies serving a wider political order. This process did not make every mountain shrine the same. And recent archaeology emphasizes variation among high-altitude sites. Some contained platforms and offerings, some showed limited construction, and others appear to have been approached through local practices that were never fully absorbed into a single imperial pattern. Llullaillaco belongs within this broader world. Its enormous height, visibility, isolation, and difficult approach made it unlike the ground of daily life. Reaching its upper slopes required people to leave fields, homes, and ordinary routes behind. While still carrying objects produced by the living society below, the journey created a physical separation that also carried ceremonial meaning. Every upward step produced oxygen, warmth, and access to food. While increasing distance from the familiar human environment, the mountain did not need walls to become a boundary. Its cold and height performed that separation naturally, yet human beings strengthened it by building a route, shelters, and a platform near the summit. These constructions show that sacred geography was not only an idea held in the mind, it could organize labor, direct movement, and determine where valuable offerings were placed. The 3 children entered this landscape as living bodies, whose needs remained entirely human. They still required breath, warmth, food, rest, and protection. But the ceremony carried them into a place where those needs became harder to meet. Their presence linked the social world of families and rulers to the severe environment above. It is important not to imagine that the mountain itself explains their deaths. Sacred status did not force one inevitable action. An Andean religious life included many forms of offering that did not involve human sacrifice. Llullaillaco instead reveals a particular decision made within a particular imperial ceremony. The landscape gave that decision a setting of extraordinary power because the summit stood above settlements, beyond ordinary return, and close to forces that people associated with the continuity of life: rain, water, crops, animals, ancestors, and political order. Understanding this sacred geography does not require accepting the beliefs as literal truth. It requires seeing how a society could experience land as active within human relationships, and how that experience could make a remote mountain seem like an appropriate destination for an offering whose value was meant to extend far beyond the summit. For many Andean communities, human life was understood through relationships extending beyond the living. Ancestors remained connected to families and places, mountains influenced water and weather, and fields depended on forces that no household could control alone. This did not create one uniform religion across the Andes, because beliefs differed by region, language, and history, yet a broad pattern appears in which people responded to the world through exchange, obligation, and respectful attention. Offerings could acknowledge dependence, ask for protection, mark gratitude, or restore balance after disruption. Food, drink, textiles, coca leaves, shells, animal figures, and other valued materials might be placed at sacred locations, not because the objects were meaningless, but because giving away something useful or beautiful made the act carry weight. Ancestors also formed part of this moral landscape. The dead were not always imagined as absent. Family lines, burial places, inherited land, and remembered leaders could continue shaping the authority of the living. Later written accounts describe preserved ancestors of Inca rulers participating symbolically in public life. While archaeology shows that many Andean societies treated the dead with care long before the rise of Tawantinsuyu, these practices varied greatly, and they should not be reduced to a single explanation, but they reveal that memory could be anchored in bodies, places, and objects. The forces of nature were understood with similar closeness. Rain could sustain crops or fail to arrive, frost could destroy a field in one night, and mountain water could determine whether a valley remained fertile. People did not possess modern meteorology, yet they observed seasonal patterns with precision and developed practical ways to live in difficult environments. Sacred meaning grew beside this practical knowledge. Rather than replacing it, the same community that built terraces and canals could also make offerings. Because engineering reduced danger without eliminating uncertainty, the three children of Llullaillaco were drawn into this world of dependence and response. Their journey placed human bodies at the meeting point between political authority, sacred landscape, and forces believed to affect life below. The offering was not an ordinary gift, and it should not be treated as a simple extension of everyday religious practice. Human sacrifice was exceptional, organized, and connected to major ceremonial purposes. Many Andean offerings involve no human death at all. This distinction matters because it prevents the children from becoming evidence for an imagined culture of constant violence. Their deaths belong to a specific decision made within the Inca state, not to every family, every mountain, or every act of devotion. Even the idea of reciprocity must be used carefully. It did not mean a mechanical trade in which one gift guaranteed rain, victory, or health. It described a wider expectation that relationships required giving, receiving, labor, memory, and obligation. Rulers used such ideas to connect distant provinces to Cusco, while local communities retained their own sacred places and older traditions. On Llullaillaco, the children and the objects beside them gathered these levels together. Fine clothing represented skilled labor. Miniature figures represented social and animal life. Food linked the summit to cultivated land, and the mountain linked the ceremony to water, climate, ancestry, and power. None of this reveals exactly what every participant believed. Some may have understood the event through imperial teaching, others through local custom, and the children themselves left no words explaining what they had been told. Honest history can therefore describe the structure of belief without inventing agreement, certainty, or consent. The preserved bodies show what was given, the summit shows where it was given, and the surrounding world helps explain why such a place could be considered capable of receiving a gift, yet the silence of the children remains outside every surviving explanation. And this boundary is essential because evidence can reveal how a ceremony was organized without allowing modern observers to claim access to the private hopes, fears, or final understanding of those brought there. Near the summit of Llullaillaco, the presence of paths, shelters, walls, and a ceremonial platform shows that people did more than climb toward a sacred place. They changed the mountain so that a planned event could occur there. Building at such height demanded knowledge, labor, supplies, and time. Stone had to be selected and moved, surfaces had to be prepared, and temporary places of rest had to be created for those who could not remain long in the thin air. The structures were not large cities or permanent villages. Because the upper mountain could not support ordinary settlement, they were limited spaces designed for movement, waiting, protection, and ceremony. This difference is important, since it shows that the summit was never meant to become part of daily life. It was approached, used, and left behind. Every construction helped people survive for a short time in a place where the body was under constant pressure. Walls reduced wind, shelters allowed brief recovery, and paths guided travelers across unstable ground. Yet, practical function alone does not explain why so much effort was directed toward a location with no fields, water source, or lasting population. The height itself created meaning by placing the ceremony far above homes, markets, workshops, and farms. As people climbed, the inhabited world gradually disappeared below them. Sounds became fewer, vegetation thinned, and the horizon widened while the body grew weaker. This physical separation transformed the journey into more than transportation. It became a passage away from ordinary relationships and toward a place reserved for actions that could not occur in the same way. Within a settlement, the three children were carried through this constructed boundary, from environments shaped for human growth into one shaped for brief ritual presence. Their bodies still required warmth, food, oxygen, and care, but the architecture led them toward a location where those needs became increasingly difficult to meet. The human beginning of the story, therefore, remains visible in every stone. Because no platform appeared through belief alone, workers climbed, carried loads, made decisions, and exposed themselves to danger. Some may have been specialists familiar with high-altitude ceremonies, while others may have provided labor under imperial obligation. Archaeology cannot identify each person or recover every command, but it can show that the summit sanctuary resulted from coordinated effort rather than a single spontaneous act. The platform also organized how the final scene was arranged. It defined a controlled surface near the summit, separated burial spaces from the surrounding ground, and gave offerings a fixed relationship to the bodies. This order reflected a society able to turn landscape into ceremonial architecture without removing the landscape's natural power. Unlike a temple built to shield worshippers from the environment, the Llullaillaco structures left cold, wind, distance, and altitude fully present. The mountain remained an active force within the event. Its severity may have strengthened the sense that the ceremony belonged beyond ordinary human space. But this meaning should not be confused with a proven desire to preserve the children forever. The builders could observe that cold slowed decay. Yet there is no secure evidence that modern-style preservation was their central purpose. What can be said is that they chose a place where return was difficult, disturbance was unlikely, and the offering would remain separated from everyday use. The summit was reached through engineering, but its remoteness was never conquered. It continued to limit movement, breath, and survival. The structures reveal a careful balance between human control and environmental danger. Enough was built to allow the ceremony, but not enough to make the place ordinary. And in that narrow space between preparation and exposure, the children were placed where society, belief, and the physical limits of the human body met in a single irreversible decision. The buildings therefore explain how people reached the sacred height, while leaving unanswered why young lives became the offerings carried there. The three children found on Llullaillaco are usually known today as the Maiden, the Boy, and the Lightning Girl, but these names belong to the modern world, not to the lives they once lived. No surviving record preserves what their families called them, what words they answered to, or how their communities understood them before the final journey began. The names used by archaeologists and museums help distinguish the bodies. Yet they also remind us how much personal identity was lost even when the bodies themselves remained. The Maiden was the oldest of the three, an adolescent girl whose seated posture, carefully arranged hair, and preserved face created an impression of stillness that many observers found difficult to separate from sleep. The boy was younger, wrapped and placed in a different position, with his body showing that the same ceremony did not treat every child in exactly the same way. The Lightning Girl was also young, and her modern name refers to damage caused by a lightning strike after burial, not to an event during her life. The strike affected part of her body and clothing, yet the frozen chamber protected enough detail for scientists to recognize her as an individual, rather than only a set of bones. These three labels are useful, but they can quietly turn people into symbols. The Maiden can become only a calm face, the Boy only a tragic child, and the Lightning Girl only the body marked by the storm. Their real lives were larger than those final images. Each had passed through years of growth before reaching the mountain. Each had learned how to move, eat, speak, respond to adults, and belong within a social world that existed far below the summit. The beginning of their story was not the ceremonial platform, but ordinary human dependence. They were born needing warmth, food, protection and care, and for years other people met those needs. Even if archaeology cannot identify who those people were, their bones, teeth, hair and tissues record development, while their presence together records the moment when separate lives were drawn into one state ceremony. It is tempting to imagine their personalities from the expressions preserved on their faces, but this would cross the boundary of evidence. A lowered head does not reveal acceptance, fear, exhaustion, or sleep without further support. A closed mouth cannot tell us what was said, and a carefully arranged body cannot explain what the child understood. The preservation creates closeness, yet closeness is not knowledge. We can see more of them than is usually possible in ancient human remains, but we still know less about their inner lives than their visible features might suggest. The modern names therefore serve two opposite purposes. They allow the children to be discussed as distinct individuals, while also showing that their original identities are beyond recovery. None should be treated as merely one example of a ritual category, because the evidence reveals different ages, bodies, positions, and histories, and later scientific study would show that their preparation did not unfold in precisely the same way. Even so, they shared the same final setting, the same high mountain, and the same loss of personal voice. The responsibility of history is to hold both facts together, to study what remains without pretending that preservation returned the whole person, and to remember that before they became the Maiden, the Boy, and the Lightning Girl, they were three children whose true names disappeared while their bodies endured. Their preserved differences also warn against speaking of them, as though one decision erased every distinction between them. The ceremony joined their deaths, but it did not make their earlier lives identical. Each body arrived with a separate history of nourishment, movement, illness, care, and social treatment, most of which can be approached only through cautious scientific evidence rather than a complete personal story that can be recovered. The clothing and hair of the three children preserve evidence that their final journey was prepared with great care, because every garment, fastening, ornament, and arrangement belonged to a social world in which textiles carried meaning beyond simple protection from cold. The Maiden wore a fitted dress secured with a decorated sash, and a woven mantle rested across her shoulders, fastened with a silver pin. Her face bore red pigment, her hair had been carefully arranged, and a ceremonial headdress made with camelid wool and white feathers accompanied her burial. These details suggest that she had been presented in a highly formal way, but they do not reveal the full path by which she reached that position. Some interpretations connect her with the Akla, girls selected and educated within institutions serving religious and political purposes. Yet this identification remains cautious rather than certain. The boy wore finely made clothing and ornaments that included metal pectorals and bracelets, objects whose materials and workmanship indicate unusual value. His burial also contained slings made from camelid fiber, linking his ceremonial equipment with activities and symbols associated with the male world. The lightning girl wore clothing recognizable within Inca traditions, and the small female figures buried with her were dressed in fine textiles that may reflect elite styles and different regional identities. Taken together, these objects show that the children were not sent upward in the worn clothing of an accidental journey. They were dressed, decorated, and accompanied in ways designed to make their presence suitable for a major offering. Cloth was especially important in Tawantinsuyu because producing it required time, skill, animal fiber, plant dyes, spinning, weaving, and the organized labor of specialists. Fine textiles could express rank, obligation, identity, and connection to state authority. So placing valuable garments in a burial meant removing both material wealth and human labor from ordinary circulation. The children carried that accumulated work on their bodies, each thread linking the mountain to herders, spinners, dyers, weavers, metal workers, and families living far below. Their hair also formed part of the visible preparation. In Andean societies, hairstyles could communicate age, gender, community, or social condition. Although the exact meaning of every arrangement at Llullaillaco cannot be recovered, the care given to the maiden's hair shows that appearance was intentionally controlled before burial. Later scientific analysis would use strands of hair as a biological timeline, but even before laboratory study, the styling itself showed that the body had become central to the ceremony. The red pigment on the maiden's face and the carefully fitted garments did not transform her into an abstract symbol. Beneath every ceremonial layer remained a growing human body, shaped by earlier years of food, movement, illness, and care. This distinction matters because signs of high status do not prove that the children possessed power over the decision that brought them to the mountain. Valuable clothing can show how others presented them, but it cannot establish consent, pride, fear, or understanding. The garments reveal investment by adults and institutions, while the silence of the children prevents a complete account of what that investment meant to them. Closed leather footwear found among the assemblage also appears to have been finely made and suitable for ceremonial use. Yet even such objects must be interpreted carefully, because later explanations about footwear and sacred status do not provide direct access to every choice made on Llullaillaco. What remains secure is the pattern of deliberate preparation. Rare materials, specialized craftsmanship, and visual distinction. The children were separated from ordinary appearance before they were separated from ordinary life. And their clothing preserved the moment when social value, political authority, and religious purpose were placed upon three individual bodies, without preserving the voices that might have explained how those bodies experienced the change. Their garments can therefore tell us how the ceremony valued them, but never whether that value protected them as living children. The preservation of the Llullaillaco children allows modern observers to see faces, hair, clothing, and posture. But the same clarity can make it easy to forget that evidence is never the whole of a person. Archaeology usually meets ancient individuals through scattered bones, broken objects, or disturbed graves. While these children remain physically recognizable enough to create a powerful sense of closeness, yet recognition does not restore identity. Their original names are unknown, their voices are gone, and no written account records the ordinary relationships that shaped their early years. The maiden, the boy, and the lightning girl are useful modern labels, but they cannot replace the names spoken by parents, relatives, companions, or members of their communities. Returning humanity to the evidence begins by accepting this loss, rather than filling it with an invented story. Their bodies show growth, nourishment, illness, movement, and ceremonial preparation, while their garments and offerings reveal skilled labor and deliberate social value. None of these traces can tell us exactly what each child believed, whether they understood the destination, or how they experienced the adults who guided them. A face preserved in stillness may invite an observer to imagine sleep, peace, fear, or resignation. But appearance alone cannot support those conclusions. The honest approach is quieter. It recognizes that a human life existed beyond the final position in which the body was found. Each child had spent years within a household and a community before becoming connected to imperial ritual. Each had learned habits of food, speech, movement, and social behavior through repeated care from other people. The biological evidence preserved on the mountain begins with that dependence, because no child reaches adolescence or early childhood without receiving food, warmth, protection, and instruction from a living group. This does not prove that every relationship was gentle, nor does it reveal how selection for the ceremony occurred, but it places the children back inside the basic human history from which the mountain removed them. They were not created as offerings. They became offerings through decisions made after years of ordinary growth. This distinction also changes how the objects beside them should be understood. Textiles, ornaments, figures, food, and vessels are not decorations surrounding an archaeological spectacle. They are products of many hands and signs of a society directing its resources toward a sacred purpose. The children stood at the center of that investment. Yet high value within a ceremony did not preserve their ability to choose their future. Modern study must therefore hold two truths together. The remains provide rare information about Inca life and ritual, and the individuals being studied were children whose deaths cannot be reduced to the usefulness of the knowledge gained afterward. Careful language helps maintain that balance. Terms such as specimen, mummy, or discovery can be technically convenient, but repeated without reflection, they may distance the listener from the person who once occupied the body. The opposite danger is to invent intimate thoughts and turn silence into a dramatic narrative. Respect lies between these errors. Using the available evidence fully while refusing to claim what the evidence cannot contain, the mountain preserved tissue, clothing, and ceremonial order, but it did not preserve consent, memory, affection, or personal meaning. Those absences are not empty spaces for imagination to complete. They are boundaries that protect the children from being remade according to modern expectations. To see them clearly is therefore not to believe that everything about them has survived. It is to recognize how much of a human being can disappear even when the body remains, and to let that missing life guide the care with which every visible trace is interpreted. The surviving evidence can bring them nearer to the present, but nearness should deepen restraint rather than encourage possession, because the faces now visible to strangers once belonged within relationships that cannot be reconstructed, measured, displayed, or returned to them. To understand the ceremony that brought 3 children to Llullaillaco, historians must listen to 2 incomplete kinds of evidence: the silent arrangement beneath the mountain and the written accounts produced after the Inca world had already been transformed by Spanish conquest. Archaeology provides the more direct record of what happened at the summit. 3 young bodies were placed in separate chambers beside carefully chosen offerings, including finely made textiles, miniature human and animal figures, vessels, food, feathers, shell and metal objects, paths, shelters, and a ceremonial platform connected these burials to an organized ascent rather than an accidental death. Similar combinations of high mountain architecture, valuable offerings, and sacrificed children have been found at other Andean peaks, allowing researchers to recognize Llullaillaco as belonging to the imperial ceremony commonly called Capacocha. Yet material evidence does not preserve the spoken prayers, political announcement, or reason given for one particular event. For those questions, scholars compare the remains with colonial chronicles. These texts were written by different authors during the decades after Europeans entered the Andes. Some gathered testimony from Inca nobles and other indigenous informants, while others interpreted Andean customs through Christian ideas that could distort what they described. The accounts do not always agree, but several describe state ceremonies in which children and valuable goods were selected from different regions, brought into a wider imperial process, and offered during moments considered important to rulers and communities. Such occasions could include the death or accession of a ruler, military or political changes, requests concerning weather and harvests, or efforts to respond to crisis. Some chroniclers also wrote that chosen children travelled to Cusco before being sent towards sacred places in distant provinces. But no surviving document names the 3 children of Llullaillaco or records every stage of their journey. This difference between general description and individual proof must remain clear. The chronicles help explain the wider ritual pattern. While the summit itself shows what was done in one place, neither source should be forced to say more than it can support. Archaeology confirms planning, investment, human sacrifice, and the connection between children, state resources, and sacred landscape. Colonial writing suggests how Inca authorities and participants may have understood ceremonies of this kind, but the words were recorded after conquest, translation, violence. Religious conversion and political disruption had altered the world being described. Even familiar terms may carry meanings that changed when moved from an Andean language into Spanish. This caution also prevents a familiar mistake, treating later descriptions as a complete script that every ceremony followed without variation. The Inca governed many peoples across immense distances, and local sacred traditions could shape how an imperial offering was received, arranged, or remembered. Even when the materials reflected authority from Cusco at Llullaillaco, the human beginning of the evidence is therefore fragile. The children lived before the documents were written, and the adults who prepared them left no direct testimony that can be securely connected to their names or families. Modern researchers must rebuild the context from bodies, objects, architecture, chemistry, and texts whose authors had different purposes. This combined method is stronger than relying on only one source, because a chronicler may describe an ideal ceremony that was not followed everywhere, while a burial may reveal actions without explaining the beliefs surrounding them. At Llullaillaco, the careful placement of the children and offerings closely resembles patterns described for Capacocha, making that identification widely accepted. Yet it does not prove which imperial event prompted the ceremony, whether every person shared the same interpretation, or how local communities responded. The evidence shows a state-supported sacred act carried out with extraordinary preparation, while the exact political moment, the words spoken, and the private experience of the children remain beyond recovery. History becomes more truthful here, not by choosing between objects and written memory, but by allowing each to correct the limits of the other. Capacocha was not simply a religious act performed apart from government. It joined sacred obligation to the political order of Tawantinsuyu, allowing the Inca state to gather people, labor, valuable materials, and distant places within one ceremony. Colonial accounts and archaeological evidence suggest that such offerings could be connected with major events, including the rule of an emperor, public crisis, military change, or appeals concerning the well-being of communities. But the precise reason for the Llullaillaco ceremony has not survived, so no single event should be presented as certain. What remains visible is the scale of organization. Children had to be selected, prepared, clothed, transported, supplied, and accompanied across long distances. Fine textiles had to be woven, metal and shell figures had to be made, food and vessels had to be gathered, roads and shelters had to be maintained, and experienced people had to guide the movement toward an extreme summit. Every offering therefore carried more than symbolic meaning. It also carried evidence of the state's capacity to direct human work. The small figures placed near the children represented human beings and camelids in arranged forms, while their materials connected the ceremony to regions and crafts. Cloth preserved the labor of herders, spinners, dyers and weavers. Metals reflected mining and production. Shells linked the mountain to distant waters and exchange routes, and food joined the frozen summit to cultivated ground far below. When all of these materials were removed from use and placed beyond easy recovery, the act displayed both devotion and control. It showed that the state could gather value from communities and dedicate it at a sacred place. Yet imperial order did not erase local belief. Mountains already held meaning for Andean peoples before Inca expansion, and leaders, families, guides, workers, and ritual specialists may have understood the ceremony through different traditions. Tawantinsuyu could connect these local sacred landscapes to Cusco without making every community think in exactly the same way. This is why Capacocha should not be described only as faith or only as politics. It worked where the two could not be cleanly separated. A ruler's authority was presented within a sacred relationship, and a sacred offering was carried through institutions able to command roads, labor, and resources. The three children stood at the center of this union. Their youth and ceremonial preparation made them exceptionally valuable within the ritual logic described by later sources. But value did not mean freedom. The honor attributed to an offering by adults cannot be treated as proof that a child understood, accepted, or chose the role. The human beginning of the event remains a set of young lives, first sustained by families and communities, then redirected into an imperial purpose larger than any one household. Their bodies were brought from the world of daily care into a ceremony that transformed social belonging into permanent separation. The offerings around them strengthened this transformation by presenting an ordered image of society on the mountain. People, animals, clothing, food, wealth, and sacred geography were gathered into one arrangement. The summit became a place where imperial power could appear to address forces beyond control, while the sacrifice also affirmed relationships among the capital, provincial territories, and important local places. Archaeology cannot tell us whether every participant experienced this as unity, grief, obligation, fear, privilege, or coercion, and those possibilities should not be reduced to one emotion. What it can show is that the ceremony required coordination across generations of knowledge and many levels of society, from the hands producing cloth to the officials directing movement and the adults leading children upward. Capacocha created order by arranging unequal roles around a shared sacred act, but the preservation on Llullaillaco also reveals the cost of that order, because beneath the fine garments and valuable objects remained three children whose lives ended so that a society could express continuity, authority, and obligation on the mountain. Why children were chosen for Capacocha cannot be reduced to one simple belief, because the evidence comes from ceremonies performed across a large and diverse empire, from burials that differ in detail, and from colonial descriptions written after the Inca world had been violently changed. Those sources commonly suggest that selected children were valued because they were young, physically unmarked by adult life, and suitable for an offering presented as exceptionally pure. But purity was a cultural idea defined by adults and institutions, not a condition that protected the children from harm. Some accounts describe boys and girls chosen from families of status or offered through provincial authorities, while archaeology shows that fine clothing, careful grooming, valuable objects, and long preparation could distinguish them from ordinary travelers. Selection may therefore have expressed several things at once: the religious value assigned to youth, the participation of important families, the authority of the state over distant provinces, and the desire to give something considered beyond replacement. An animal, textile, vessel, or metal figure could carry great value, yet a child represented a living relationship between a household, a community, and future generations. Removing that child from ordinary life made the offering permanent in a way that stored goods alone could not be. This helps explain the severe logic of the ceremony without making that logic morally acceptable. The children were not chosen because Inca society failed to recognize their value. They may have been chosen precisely because the society considered them valuable, and that is the colder paradox preserved on Llullaillaco. High ceremonial importance and personal vulnerability could exist within the same act. Later reports sometimes describe the families of selected children receiving honor or status, and some portray participation as a privilege connected to imperial religion. But such language must be handled carefully. A family may have faced political expectations, religious obligation, social pressure, genuine belief, or several of these together, while the child remained dependent on decisions made by adults. No surviving testimony allows us to know whether the three from Llullaillaco were volunteered, requested, demanded, or selected through a more complicated negotiation. Their fine treatment before death cannot answer that question. Good food, formal clothing, ritual attention, and public importance show preparation, not consent. The human beginning of their lives lay in years of care before selection. When their bodies belong to the ordinary cycle through which one generation raises the next, Capacocha redirected that cycle, turning children who might have carried family memory forward into offerings intended to support a wider order of rulers, communities, ancestors, sacred places, and natural forces. This did not mean that children were commonly sacrificed throughout daily Inca life. Available evidence presents Capacocha as an exceptional state ceremony associated with major sacred and political concerns, and most acts of Andean devotion did not require human death. The distinction matters because history should neither hide the violence nor portray an entire civilization as defined only by it. At Llullaillaco, the children appear to have been chosen through a process that invested them with ceremonial status before the ascent, yet the exact reason each individual was selected remains unknown. Age, appearance, family position, regional representation, ritual role, or institutional affiliation may all have mattered, but the evidence does not allow one universal rule to be applied with certainty. Even the category of childhood was shaped by social expectations different from those of the present. So modern ideas about innocence cannot simply be projected backward. Although the dependence of young people on adult authority remains clear across time, what can be said is that the ceremony placed its greatest meaning upon those with the least power to determine its course, and the preserved bodies leave us facing a difficult truth. A society can surround children with honor, beauty, and sacred language while still taking from them the future that made their lives valuable to their communities. Before any ascent toward Llullaillaco, the three children had to be separated from the ordinary settings in which their lives had begun, from households, local paths, familiar foods, and the people who had guided their growth. Colonial accounts describe Capacocha as a process that could draw selected children and representatives from different regions toward Cusco, where ceremonies linked provincial communities to the center of Tawantinsuyu. Some accounts also mention parents or local leaders accompanying them, although no surviving record proves the complete route followed by the children found on Llullaillaco. This distinction matters because the wider pattern is documented more clearly than the personal journey of any one child. Archaeology can show that they reached the mountain with formal clothing and valuable offerings, while changes preserved in their bodies suggest a period of preparation before death. But the place where each stage occurred remains uncertain. Selection itself may have changed how a child was treated. Food could become richer, clothing more elaborate, hair more carefully arranged, and daily movement more controlled by adults serving religious and political purposes. Such treatment did not remove the child from human need. The body still required rest, nourishment, warmth, and reassurance. Yet the social meaning placed upon that body was being transformed. A son or daughter connected to one household could now represent a community within an imperial ceremony. This movement from local belonging towards ceremonial identity was not a single step. It likely involved waiting, instruction, travel, public presentation, and repeated dependence on adults. But the surviving evidence does not allow those moments to be narrated as a complete personal story. There are no reliable words from the children, no record of conversations with their families, and no secure account of how selection was explained to them. The honest reconstruction must therefore remain close to institutions and material traces. Tawantinsuyu possessed roads, storehouses, officials, religious specialists, and systems of labor capable of supporting long journeys. Local authorities could connect households to state demands, while ceremonial centers gathered people from regions that otherwise remained far apart. Cusco held special importance in later descriptions because it represented the political and sacred center from which offerings could be acknowledged before being sent outward again. This outward movement carried imperial order back into provincial landscapes. A child drawn from a distant community could pass through the center and then be directed toward another sacred destination, joining family, province, ruler, and mountain within one ritual sequence. Whether every Llullaillaco child completed precisely this route cannot be proven, yet the organization visible at the summit fits a ceremony that required preparation beyond the final climb. The fine garments were not produced on the frozen platform, the miniature figures were not created there, and the food, vessels, feathers, metals, and shells had to be gathered before the travellers entered the severe highlands. Many unnamed people, therefore, stood between the children's earlier homes and their burial chambers. Some made objects, some supplied food, some maintained roads, some carried loads, and some exercised authority. The children moved through this network while becoming increasingly separated from ordinary choices. Every stage may have been presented as sacred or honourable by those directing it, But ceremonial importance cannot reveal what the children understood. Their dependence remained the quiet center of the process. Adults selected the route, controlled the pace, arranged the clothing, and determined the destination. By the time the mountain appeared before them, the journey had already changed their place within society. They were no longer traveling merely as children from particular communities. They were being carried as offerings whose meaning had been organized by an empire, even though the lives beneath that meaning remained individual, unfinished, and largely unknown. The ceremonial center therefore functioned as a threshold, gathering children from living communities, placing them under imperial attention, and preparing their bodies and identities for destinations chosen far beyond the control of their families. The journey toward Llullaillaco would have crossed a world that changed slowly with distance and height, beginning among inhabited valleys where water, fields, animals, and human voices still shaped daily life, then moving through open country where settlements became fewer and the land offered less shelter. No surviving record preserves the exact route taken by the maiden, the boy, or the lightning girl, so their progress cannot be described as a complete itinerary. Yet the wider road system of Tawantinsuyu shows how an organized ceremonial party could travel across regions that would otherwise appear divided by deserts, ravines, plateaus, and mountains. Some roads followed older paths created by communities long before Inca expansion, while others were repaired, widened, or linked to administrative and sacred places. Travelers moved on foot, llamas carried selected loads, and storehouses or resting sites could provide food, cloth, tools, and temporary protection. These arrangements did not make travel easy. They made it possible. Every landscape still imposed its own demands. Dry areas required knowledge of water, high valleys exposed bodies to cold nights, steep passes slowed movement, and strong sunlight could be followed by sudden freezing temperatures. The children remained dependent on the adults around them throughout this passage. Others chose when they rested, what they ate, how quickly they moved, and which road brought them closer to the mountain. Even if the journey was described to them in sacred language, the physical experience was carried by young bodies that tired, hungered, and adjusted to unfamiliar air. Archaeology should not invent their conversations or place modern emotions into their silence, but it can recognize the growing separation created by travel. Each stage carried them farther from the communities where their lives had begun, and deeper into a ceremonial process controlled by people with greater authority. Materials traveling with them also reveal the reach of that process. Fine textiles, metal objects, shells, feathers, vessels, food, and miniature figures came from skilled labor and environments spread across the Andean world. Their movement toward Llullaillaco gathered distant places into one traveling group. The road therefore carried more than bodies. It carried political order, religious purpose, and the work of people who would never see the summit. As the party entered the southern highlands, familiar signs of settlement would have become less frequent. Cultivated ground gave way to dry slopes and broad spaces where survival depended on preparation. Local guides may have supplied knowledge of routes and conditions. Although the identities of those who accompanied the children are unknown, the approach to Llullaillaco eventually narrowed from a regional network into a mountain path leading towards structures built for temporary use. Here the road changed in meaning. Behind it lay communication, exchange, and administration. Ahead lay a destination where no permanent community could live. The final stages required, carrying fuel, food, clothing, ceremonial objects, and enough human strength to continue in thin air. Altitude could bring headache, weakness, breathlessness, confusion, or exhaustion, but the precise symptoms experienced by each traveler cannot be recovered. What remains visible is the organization that allowed the group to continue despite those risks. The long journey did not begin at the summit, and it did not belong only to the three children. It rested on generations of Andean knowledge, on roads maintained by communities, on stored resources, and on adults directing every movement. By the time the children reached the base of the final ascent, the distance behind them had already transformed a local life into an imperial offering, while the mountain ahead would complete a separation that no road was intended to reverse. No evidence tells us how long the complete passage lasted or how many pauses were made. And climate, season, starting point, and ceremonial obligations could all have changed its pace. Certainty begins only where physical traces remain, with roads, facilities, offerings, and bodies that reach the same remote destination under deliberate guidance. The final ascent toward the summit of Llullaillaco carried the ceremonial party beyond the last places where ordinary travel could be sustained for long. The road narrowed into a high mountain route, vegetation became scarce, water was difficult to obtain, and every load required more effort as the air grew thinner. At such elevation, the human body receives less oxygen with every breath. Movement slows, sleep becomes less restorative, and simple tasks can demand careful pauses. Experienced Andean travelers understood many dangers of altitude: cold, wind, and exposure. But knowledge could reduce risk only for a limited time. It could not make the summit suitable for permanent life. The children therefore approached a place where their biological needs became increasingly difficult to meet. They needed warmth, food, water, rest, and protection, while the adults directing the ascent had to preserve enough strength to carry supplies, ceremonial objects, fuel, and equipment towards structures built near the top. Llamas may have supported movement at lower stages, but people still had to manage the steepest ground, and the final transfer of valuable materials. The exact size of the group is unknown, as are the number of stops and the pace of the climb. Yet the surviving route, shelters, and platform show that the ascent had been prepared rather than improvised. Temporary buildings allowed travelers to pause and shield themselves from wind. Stored materials could reduce the need to carry everything in one movement, and guides familiar with the mountain could choose safer passages. Even with these preparations, the climb remained dangerous, because altitude can bring headache, weakness, nausea, confusion, breathlessness, and loss of coordination. Although no evidence allows these symptoms to be assigned with certainty to any one child, cold added another burden, especially after sunset, when exposed ground lost heat quickly and the body had fewer ways to recover. The human beginning of the journey remained visible here in its simplest form. 3 young bodies depended completely on adults for every decision, from when to stop to what to eat and whether to continue. Ceremonial status did not change their need for care, and sacred purpose did not remove the physical cost of the climb. Each upward movement placed greater distance between the children and the inhabited world where their lives had begun. Below them lay roads used for farming, exchange, government, and family movement. Above them lay a platform created for an event that would not return them to those uses. The adults who climbed beside them also faced strain, showing that the ceremony required more than belief. It required coordinated labor, discipline, local knowledge, and the willingness to expose many people to danger. Clothing had to protect against wind, food had to remain usable, fuel had to be carried where trees could not grow, and the burial spaces had to be prepared in frozen or hardened ground. Every object later found beside the children had passed through these same conditions. Fine textiles, figures, vessels, feathers, food, and ornaments reached the summit because people repeatedly chose to carry them farther. Their weight turned symbolic value into physical effort, and that effort made the final arrangement possible. By the time the group arrived near the summit, the ceremony had gathered the strength of an empire into a place where empire could not command the weather, increase the oxygen, or make the cold harmless. Human organization reached its limit there. The road ended, the structures offered only temporary shelter, and the mountain remained stronger than every traveler. The final ascent therefore reveals the central tension of Llullaillaco. A powerful society could coordinate a journey across enormous distance and raise precious offerings toward the sky. Yet it brought 3 children into an environment where the conditions that threatened life would also preserve their bodies long after the people, commands, and beliefs surrounding them had disappeared from the living world that had once sustained them. A strand of hair grows slowly enough to preserve a sequence of changes, forming a biological record that begins near the scalp with the most recent weeks and extends toward the tip into earlier months. Once hair is formed, much of its chemical structure remains stable, so researchers can divide a long strand into small measured lengths and examine how the signals change along it. This does not create a diary of thoughts or daily events. but it can show broad shifts in food, movement, and exposure to certain plants. The Llullaillaco children offered an unusually clear opportunity for this work because their hair remained attached to preserved bodies and had been protected from ordinary decay. Scientists examined stable forms of elements such as carbon and nitrogen, which enter the body through food and become incorporated into growing tissue. Different plants and different positions within a food chain leave distinguishable patterns. Although those patterns must always be interpreted within the agriculture and ecology of the Andes, maize produces a different carbon signal from many other cultivated plants. While increasing amounts of animal protein can influence nitrogen values, by reading these changes in sequence, researchers could compare earlier nourishment with food consumed closer to death. The maiden's long hair preserved the most extended record, revealing a pronounced change roughly within the final year of her life. Her chemical pattern shifted from a diet associated with more ordinary local foods toward one containing greater amounts of maize and animal protein. Foods that carried importance and status within the Inca world. Similar evidence of change appeared in the other children. Though their shorter hair and individual histories did not preserve identical timelines, these results do not identify each meal, the person who served it, or the location where it was eaten. They reveal a gradual alteration in nourishment consistent with a period of ceremonial preparation. The hair therefore connects the mountain burial to a process that began long before the final ascent, when the children were still living among adults who controlled their food, appearance, and movement. This return to the human beginning is essential, because an isotope value is not merely a number, it records substances absorbed by a growing child whose body depended upon other people. Richer food may indicate elevated social treatment, institutional preparation, travel, seasonal availability, or several influences acting together, and science cannot convert it automatically into proof of happiness, honor, or consent. Strands found in small bags beside the children added another kind of evidence. Comparisons indicated that cut hair associated with each individual belonged to that same child, and the maiden's preserved sequence suggested that some of her hair had been cut months before death. While her remaining hair was later trimmed and carefully braided close to the ceremony, hair cutting may have marked a change in status. As researchers have proposed by comparing the biological timeline with historical descriptions, but its exact personal meaning cannot be recovered. The strength of hair analysis lies in sequence rather than certainty about emotion. It can show that the children's lives were changing before the mountain, that preparation unfolded over time, and that the maiden in particular experienced a substantial dietary transition, yet the record remains uneven. Growth rates vary between individuals, contamination must be controlled, and chemical signals can have more than one cause. Responsible interpretation therefore combines the hair with clothing, burial arrangement, radiological study, archaeology, and cautious use of colonial accounts. No strand speaks alone. This slow archive also prevents the final ceremony from being mistaken for an isolated decision made only after the travelers reached Llullaillaco itself. Together, these traces reveal that the frozen scene was not created during one sudden night. It was the end of a longer transformation written quietly into the tissue growing from the children's heads, a transformation visible in chemistry, even though its words, explanations, and private experience have disappeared. The chemical record in the children's hair shows that preparation for Llullaillaco did not begin only when the mountain came into view. It had already entered their bodies through food, because the meals given to a growing child reflect the resources, decisions, and social position surrounding that child. In the Andes, maize carried ceremonial and political importance, while animal protein was not distributed equally in every household or region, so a sustained increase in both could indicate more than a seasonal change. In the maiden's hair, the clearest shift appeared about a year before death. Earlier segments suggest a diet more typical of ordinary highland life, with less animal protein and a stronger contribution from plants using the common C3 pathway. Later segments show greater consumption of maize and animal foods. The change was strong enough to suggest that the way she was being fed had altered substantially. Researchers have interpreted this as evidence that her status was raised during preparation for Capacocha, perhaps when she entered closer supervision by institutions connected with the Inca state. but the chemistry cannot identify the exact building where she lived. The people who served her, or the title she was given, it records treatment rather than a complete biography. The boy and the lightning girl also preserve signs of changing nourishment, yet their patterns are not identical to the maiden's. The boy's available hair already reflects a diet rich in maize for much of the period preserved, so an earlier transition may have occurred before the surviving sequence began. The lightning girl shows changes that can also be read as increased access to valued foods, though her shorter record offers less time to observe. These differences matter because one ritual process did not erase individual histories, age, place of origin, previous diet, season, health, and the length of preserved hair could all shape the signals scientists measure. The evidence therefore supports a broad pattern of altered provisioning. Without proving that every child passed through the same schedule, richer food may have marked ceremonial distinction, but it could also have supported long travel and helped supply a group moving through state storehouses. Maize was portable, storable, and available along important routes, while dried meat could provide concentrated nourishment. The final months may therefore combine social elevation with the practical needs of pilgrimage. These explanations are not mutually exclusive, and the hair cannot separate them completely. The human meaning remains clear even where interpretation is limited. Adults controlled what the children received, and repeated meals slowly changed the chemistry of tissue growing from their heads. What appears in a laboratory as a rising isotope value began as food placed before a dependent young person. The shift shows care in the sense of attention and provisioning. But attention is not the same as protection. Improved diet did not return control over the destination, nor can it be used as evidence that a child accepted the ceremony. The state could surround the chosen with fine food, clothing, grooming, and public importance while continuing a process that would end their lives. This is why social treatment must be described without romantic language. The children may have been honored according to the beliefs of adults around them, but honor existed beside unequal power. Changes in diet show that their ordinary routines were being reorganized, possibly for many months, and that the frozen burial was the final result of a longer separation from earlier life. Hair preserves this transition with unusual intimacy, yet it remains silent about whether a richer meal brought comfort, confusion, familiarity, or fear. Those experiences disappeared, leaving only the slow biological trace of a society feeding children differently as it prepared to take them farther from home. The contrast between better nourishment and approaching death does not solve the ritual's meaning. It reveals how value and vulnerability could be deliberately joined within the same institutional process. The hair of the Llullaillaco children preserved another change that food alone could not explain. Chemical analysis found evidence that all three had consumed coca and alcohol during the period leading toward their deaths. Yet these substances must be understood within the Andean world rather than through modern assumptions. Coca leaves had long been used in ritual life, social exchange, work, and travel at altitude, while maize beer, often known as chicha, could appear in feasts, offerings, and ceremonies. Their presence, therefore, does not by itself prove that the children were unconscious, forced, calm, or aware of what was approaching. It shows that adults provided substances carrying both practical and sacred meanings, and that the pattern of consumption changed as the ceremony drew nearer. The maiden offers the clearest sequence because her long hair preserved many months of growth. Levels associated with coca rose markedly during the final year, reached a high point months before death, and remained elevated, while chemical evidence connected with alcohol increased most strongly during the final weeks. Researchers also found coca leaves between her teeth, providing a direct physical trace alongside the timeline in her hair. The younger children showed evidence of coca and alcohol as well, but their shorter records and different patterns do not support one identical schedule for all three. This variation suggests that age, ritual role, treatment, or circumstance influenced how the substances were given. Although the evidence cannot identify which explanation mattered most, coca may have helped travelers endure fatigue, hunger, cold, or discomfort at altitude. Alcohol may have been offered ceremonially and may also have made the children drowsy or less responsive, especially near the summit. But hair chemistry cannot measure consciousness, intention, dosage at one exact moment, or the private experience of the person who consumed it. Even the presence of both substances near death does not allow science to reconstruct a complete final scene. The body at extreme altitude was already facing thin air, freezing temperatures, exhaustion, and reduced physical control. Coca and alcohol entered that biological situation, but their precise contribution to death cannot be separated with certainty from the surrounding environment, and the different evidence preserved in each child. The human beginning of this record lies once again in dependence. These were young people receiving food, drink, leaves, clothing, and instructions from adults who controlled the journey. Repeated consumption over weeks or months indicates supervision and preparation rather than a substance encountered by chance. Yet supervision could contain ritual care and coercion at the same time. A drink offered in a valued vessel might carry honor within the ceremony, while also reducing a child's ability to resist or understand what followed. The evidence therefore brings the children closer without revealing consent. It shows what entered their bodies, approximately when patterns changed, and how those changes aligned with the long movement towards sacrifice. But it cannot tell whether a taste was familiar, whether a child refused, whether persuasion was used, or whether the meaning of the substances had been explained. Those questions belong to voices the mountain did not preserve. Careful interpretation must also avoid replacing coca leaves with the modern idea of purified cocaine, because traditional coca use involved the plant in a very different cultural and chemical form. Just as chicha should not be imagined automatically as a modern concentrated drink, the important fact is the increasing ritual use of coca and alcohol, especially in the maiden's final months and weeks. Not a sensational claim that one substance alone caused everything. The hair reveals a controlled progression toward the summit. While its limits remind us that chemistry can record preparation more securely than it can record fear, compliance, sedation, or the final boundary between wakefulness and death, what survives is a pattern of changing treatment, not a confession from the past, and that distinction protects the children from conclusions their silent bodies cannot support. Inside the summit platform, the three children were not found together in one open grave. Each had been placed within a separate burial chamber prepared beneath the ceremonial surface. The maiden occupied the northern chamber, the boy lay in the southwest, and the lightning girl rested in the east. This arrangement shows deliberate planning because the spaces had to be opened in hard ground, shaped to receive a body and selected objects, then closed in a way that protected the contents from wind, animals, sunlight, and repeated human disturbance. The positions of the children also differed. The maiden was seated with her legs folded and her head lowered, her clothing arranged around her and her long hair carefully prepared. The lightning girl was seated as well, wrapped in textiles and accompanied by offerings, while the boy was placed in a more tightly flexed posture, wrapped in cloth and secured by cords. These differences warn against imagining one simple movement repeated 3 times. The ceremony followed an organized pattern, yet each burial had its own form. Around the bodies were miniature figures of humans and camelids, finely woven garments, feathered ornaments, vessels, food, sandals, bags, and objects made from shell, metal, wood, and fiber. Their positions mattered because archaeology does not study objects only by naming them. It studies relationships, which items stood near which body, how textiles covered or enclosed a figure, whether food remained inside a vessel, and how the chamber was filled after everything had been placed. Such relationships reveal that the scene was composed rather than abandoned. No storm gathered 3 children and valuable goods into separate chambers beneath a prepared platform. No travel accident arranged miniature figures according to ceremonial conventions, and no ordinary burial required an ascent to one of the highest archaeological sites known in the world. The evidence points instead to a final act, carried out by people who understood where every body and offering belonged. The human beginning of that arrangement remains important, because the stillness visible today was created through the movement of living hands. Adults dressed the children, carried the objects, opened the chambers, lowered or seated the bodies, placed food and figures nearby, and sealed the ground. Archaeology cannot recover every gesture or identify every person involved, but the physical order shows attention extending to the last moments of the ceremony. This attention should not be confused with gentleness or consent. careful placement can coexist with violence, and valuable offerings can surround a child whose future has been taken away. The summit setting also altered what happened afterward. Once the chambers were closed, cold and dryness slowed decay, while distance protected the burials from ordinary contact. The platform became both a ceremonial surface and a boundary between the living group that descended and the children who remained. Their bodies were left within the mountain, but not without connection to the society below. Every textile carried labour, every vessel carried food or drink, every figure represented forms of human and animal life, and every chamber preserved a decision made within Tawantinsuyu. The careful differences among the chambers also suggest that age, gender, ritual role, or local custom may have influenced the treatment of each child, although none of these possibilities can be assigned with certainty from position alone or from modern expectations about ceremonial meaning. The arrangement therefore answers one question with unusual clarity. The children did not simply become lost in severe weather. They were intentionally placed inside a sacred structure. Yet the same evidence leaves other questions unresolved. It cannot tell us what words were spoken, how long the final rite lasted, what each child understood, or which exact sequence brought life to an end. The mountain preserves the design of the ceremony more completely than the experience of those at its center, leaving an ordered scene whose purpose is visible, while its final human moments remain silent. Although the three children were placed within the same ceremonial complex, their bodies do not preserve one identical path into death, and this difference is essential because the evidence has often been compressed into the simple image of children who fell asleep in the cold. The maiden remained seated with her head lowered, her organs and soft tissues unusually well preserved, and medical imaging did not reveal a clear lethal wound that could explain her death by itself. Her hair and the coca leaves found near her mouth show prolonged ritual preparation, while the strong rise in alcohol markers near the end of her biological timeline suggests that she may have become deeply drowsy, less responsive, or unconscious. Yet chemistry cannot measure her exact state. At the moment life ended, cold, thin air, exhaustion, and alcohol may all have acted together, but none can be isolated as the single proven cause. The Lightning Girl presents another history. Areas of her face, shoulder, and clothing was damaged when lightning entered the burial after death, so those visible changes must not be mistaken for injuries inflicted during the ceremony. Beneath that later damage, her seated position and preserved tissues do not reveal an obvious fatal blow. Exposure to severe cold and reduced oxygen may have contributed strongly, perhaps while coca or alcohol altered awareness. But the available findings cannot reconstruct the final sequence with certainty. The boy was treated differently. His body was tightly flexed and wrapped. Cords restricted his position, and traces reported around his mouth and clothing have been interpreted as blood or material associated with vomiting. These signs have led researchers to consider suffocation, pressure, pulmonary distress caused by altitude, or another form of physical struggle. Yet the evidence remains debated and does not establish one mechanism beyond doubt. His compact posture may reflect the way he was placed in the chamber, restraint during the ceremony, or both. And no responsible account should turn that possibility into a witness scene. The important conclusion is not that nothing can be known, but that each body limits interpretation in a different way. The maiden preserves a long chemical record and no clear violent injury. The Lightning Girl carries post-mortem damage that can obscure later observation, and the boy shows physical signs that raise questions not answered by the two girls. Their differences also return the story to three separate young lives. Each body had its own age, health, nourishment, treatment, and response to altitude before being joined within one state ritual. The ceremony may have followed shared beliefs, but biology did not become uniform merely because the burials were arranged together. Even the phrase cause of death can suggest a neat boundary that ancient evidence rarely provides. Extreme cold can produce unconsciousness gradually. Oxygen deprivation can weaken judgment and movement. Alcohol can intensify heat loss and sedation. Binding can restrict breathing. And fear or exhaustion can alter the body's ability to endure. Several processes may have overlapped without leaving one decisive mark. The mountain preserved enough to reject the idea of accidental wandering. yet not enough to reveal every action performed near the chambers. Honest history, therefore, resists both comforting and violent certainty. It does not claim that all three died peacefully in sleep, and it does not invent a uniform execution method unsupported by their bodies. It accepts that the final hours were organized by adults, shaped by altitude and ritual substances, and experienced differently by children whose surviving tissues can show injury, preparation, and environment, but cannot testify in words. This restraint does not weaken the reality of sacrifice. It makes that reality precise, because deliberate burial is secure even when the mechanism remains uncertain. The children were taken to the summit, placed in chambers, and left there. While different evidence in their bodies reminds us that a ritual can contain separate deaths, science cannot merge into one account. The final hours on Llullaillaco cannot be restored as a single clear sequence, because the evidence preserves bodies, substances, posture, and environment, but not the exact order in which each influence acted. The children had reached an altitude where cold, exhaustion, and reduced oxygen placed every organ under strain. Breathing would have required more effort, judgment and coordination could have weakened, and the body would have lost heat more rapidly, especially after movement stopped. Coca and alcohol had also entered their systems during the period before death. And in the maiden, the strongest rise in alcohol-related markers appears close to the end of her preserved timeline. This may have increased drowsiness, reduced awareness, and made resistance to cold more difficult. Yet no analysis can tell whether she was awake, confused, asleep, or unconscious at the precise moment she died. The Lightning Girl may also have become weakened by altitude, cold, and ritual substances, but the lightning damage that affected her after burial complicates later observation and prevents her body from offering a complete record. The boy presents a different set of questions, because his tightly flexed position, binding, and traces around the mouth have led researchers to consider restricted breathing, altitude-related illness, vomiting, pressure, or physical restraint. None of these possibilities has been proven as the single cause, and several may have overlapped. The most cautious reconstruction is therefore not a dramatic scene, but a narrowing field of survival. Young bodies have been carried into extreme conditions, placed under adult control, exposed to cold and thin air, and given substances that may have altered consciousness. After this point, the final biological path could have differed for each child. One may have lost awareness gradually, another may have struggled to breathe, and another may have weakened quietly as heat and oxygen declined. But these remain possibilities rather than witnessed events. The human beginning of the story remains present even here, because every factor that science measures entered a body that once depended on ordinary care, food, warmth, sleep, and protection. The ceremony reversed those protections one by one. Adults controlled the destination, the timing, the substances, the clothing, the posture, and the moment when the children were left inside the chambers. Environmental forces then completed what the social decision had made possible. This distinction matters because the mountain did not choose them, cold did not select them, and altitude did not organize the ascent. People did. The environment may explain how death occurred and why preservation followed, but it does not explain the authority that placed the children there, nor can it tell us what meaning was spoken over them. The evidence also leaves open whether death came before the chambers were fully sealed or only after the children were enclosed, whether consciousness faded quickly or slowly, and whether every child received the same final treatment. Medical imaging, hair chemistry, tissue analysis, and burial context narrow the possibilities, yet none removes uncertainty. Responsible history must therefore avoid the comforting claim that all three simply slept and never woke, while also avoiding an invented account of violence that the bodies cannot fully support. What can be said securely is that the deaths were part of a deliberate ceremony, that the children were placed in separate prepared chambers, and that cold, hypoxia, ritual substances, restraint, or trauma may have contributed in different combinations. The last minutes remain hidden not because science has learned nothing, but because physical evidence reaches a boundary where experience, intention, and exact sequence disappear, leaving three bodies that record the conditions of death more clearly than the moment death itself arrived. Even the preserved expression of a face cannot resolve that silence. Because muscles settle, posture may be arranged, and later observers bring meanings the child never supplied, so the final account must remain incomplete, respectful, and open to revision whenever new evidence is carefully examined again. The preservation of the Llullaillaco children began with an environment that was hostile to life, but unusually protective after death. Near the summit, temperatures remained low for long periods, the air held little moisture, and the burial chambers limited exposure to sunlight, animals, insects, and repeated human disturbance. Under ordinary conditions, a body begins changing soon after death as cells break down. Bacteria multiply, enzymes digest tissues, and insects or scavengers open pathways for further decay. On the mountain, cold slowed these reactions, reduced microbial activity, and kept much of the water inside tissues frozen. Dryness also limited the moisture needed by many organisms that normally accelerate decomposition, while the thin air and severe altitude created an environment in which biological activity remained restricted. Low oxygen may also have limited some organisms. Although cold and dryness were the strongest protective forces, complete absence of moisture would have made organic materials brittle, while too much liquid water would have encouraged decay. The summit instead maintained a rare balance in which tissues remained frozen and gradually dried without being repeatedly soaked, allowing soft structures to endure while still undergoing slow physical and chemical change beneath the surface over many generations. These forces did not stop time completely. Tissues still changed. Skin lost some flexibility, organs altered, and one child suffered damage from lightning after burial. But the rate of deterioration became slow enough for hair, skin, internal organs, clothing, and food remains to survive for about 5 centuries. The chambers themselves added another layer of protection. Earth and stone reduced direct contact with wind and sunlight, buffered sudden changes in temperature, and kept the bodies in stable positions. Stability mattered because repeated freezing and thawing can damage tissue, expand water, break cells, and disturb the relationships between bodies and offerings. The summit did not maintain one perfectly unchanging temperature every hour, yet its general cold and aridity preserved the children far more effectively than the warmer, wetter environments where most human remains return quickly to soil. The human beginning of this preservation must remain clear. Nature protected bodies only after people had carried them upward, prepared chambers, arranged clothing, placed offerings, and sealed the ground. The mountain did not select the children or design the ceremony. It acted upon conditions created by human decisions. Once the adults descended, however, cold became the main guardian of what they had left behind. Microorganisms worked slowly, insects were scarce, liquid water was limited, and the remote height discouraged later visitors. Together these factors preserved not only separate tissues, but the structure of the entire scene. Hair remained connected to the scalp, garments retained folds around the body, vessels stayed near the places where they had been set, and small offerings kept their relation to each burial. This context is as important as the bodies themselves, because a preserved face can show physical appearance, while an undisturbed chamber can show intention, sequence, and care in placement. The same environment that threatened breathing and warmth during the ascent later protected evidence of the journey, creating a difficult paradox. Conditions incapable of sustaining children for long became conditions capable of holding their physical presence across generations. Even so, phrases such as frozen in time should be understood as images rather than literal descriptions. Biological change never ceased entirely, and removal from the summit introduced new risks. Warmer air could encourage deterioration, changing humidity could damage skin and textiles, and uncontrolled thawing could destroy structures that had survived for centuries. Preservation therefore continued only through careful cold storage and environmental control after discovery. The bodies appear remarkably near because the mountain slowed decay, but their survival was neither magical nor perfect. It resulted from an uncommon meeting of low temperature, dryness, isolation, burial architecture, and human action, each factor supporting the others until the children could be found with much of their final physical world still quietly in place. The bodies of the Llullaillaco children are often called mummies, but that word can create the wrong impression if it suggests that embalmers deliberately removed organs. applied preserving chemicals, or wrapped the dead through a complex artificial process, the evidence from the mountain points instead to natural preservation. The children were dressed, arranged, and placed with great ceremonial care, yet their tissues survived mainly because the summit environment slowed the ordinary processes of decay. Cold kept much of the water within the body frozen, dryness limited the moisture required by bacteria and fungi, and isolation protected the chambers from insects, animals, sunlight, and frequent disturbance. This differs from forms of intentional embalming known in other societies, where bodies were opened, treated, dried with prepared substances, or altered so that preservation could continue in warmer conditions. No comparable procedure is required to explain the children. Their internal organs remained in place. Their bodies were not preserved by removing the soft tissues most vulnerable to decay, and their survival depended on remaining within a stable, high-altitude environment. Human action still mattered, because adults selected the burial spaces, arranged textiles around the children, placed them below the ceremonial platform, and sealed the chambers. These decisions created shelter and reduced later exposure. But the mountain supplied the strongest preserving forces. The difference between burial preparation and embalming is important. One describes how the children were ceremonially placed, while the other would imply that their bodies were intentionally transformed to resist decomposition. The available evidence supports the first much more clearly than the second. Inca peoples did have long traditions of caring for certain dead bodies, and colonial descriptions record preserved ancestors of rulers being maintained within social and ceremonial life. Yet those wider practices should not be automatically imposed on the Llullaillaco children. The summit burials belong to a high mountain offering, whose preservation followed from cold and dryness, not from a proven effort to create bodies for later viewing. There is also no secure reason to claim that the adults expected the children to remain visually recognizable for 5 centuries. People familiar with high places may have known that cold changed the dead more slowly, but practical observation is not the same as a documented plan for permanent preservation. The human beginning of the story remains the same. Living children were taken into a severe environment, placed within prepared chambers, and left where natural conditions continued acting after every participant had descended. The body then entered a slow process of freezing, drying, and chemical change. Not a state in which time stopped completely. Skin, organs, hair, and clothing survived, but each continued to age in ways less visible than ordinary decomposition. This is why modern conservation must reproduce some of the stability once provided by the summit. Controlled temperature, humidity, light, and air conditions help prevent thawing, mold cracking, and other damage. Without that care, the bodies could deteriorate rapidly despite centuries of survival. Natural mummification can occur in deserts, frozen ground, peat bogs, and places with constant airflow, but each preserves a body through different chemistry and leaves different kinds of damage. Llullaillaco combined deep cold with extreme aridity and secure burial, producing survival unlike ordinary drying at lower elevation. This comparison helps explain why the children retained soft tissue while remaining altered, fragile, and dependent on careful continued protection. Calling them naturally preserved, therefore, does not make their condition simple or indestructible. It means that environment, burial architecture, and limited disturbance work together without a confirmed embalming treatment. The mountain became the preserving agent after society completed the ceremony, holding the children in cold darkness until discovery exposed them again to the warmer world below. Their survival reflects no mystery beyond nature, yet it remains extraordinary because the same forces that took warmth and breath from young bodies later protected the physical evidence of what had been done to them. The phrase perfectly preserved is often used to describe the Llullaillaco children, yet no ancient body can remain unchanged, and the word should be understood as a comparison with the severe decay that affects most human remains. The children retained skin, hair, internal organs, clothing, and recognizable facial features to an extraordinary degree, but every tissue had still passed through centuries of freezing, drying, pressure, chemical change, and gradual loss of moisture. Their bodies did not pause at the moment of death. They continued to age slowly inside the mountain, even when that change was too limited to destroy their human form. The maiden appears especially complete because her face, hair, garments, and seated posture survived with little visible disruption, yet her tissues became fragile, her skin changed in colour and texture, and her internal structures cannot be treated as though they belong to a living body. The Lightning Girl carries an even clearer reminder that preservation was never perfect. A lightning strike entered her burial after death and damaged areas of her face, neck, shoulder, clothing, and nearby objects. This injury came from the mountain long after the ceremony and must be separated from evidence concerning her final hours. The boy also experienced alterations produced by burial, pressure, freezing, and the tight arrangement of his body, while stains and material around his mouth remained difficult to interpret with certainty. Each child therefore survived differently, and the visible condition of one cannot be used as a measure for the others. The objects beside them also changed. Textiles weakened, feathers became delicate, metals reacted with surrounding materials, and food offerings lost the qualities they once held when carried upward. What endured was not an untouched moment, but a damaged and incomplete physical record preserved far beyond the usual limits. The human beginning of this record remains important, because the clarity of a face can encourage people to imagine that the whole child is still present, but preservation saved only the body and selected objects, not memory, voice, relationship, or personal understanding. The children remain biologically informative precisely because so much tissue survived. Yet that survival should never be confused with the survival of identity. After discovery, the balance that had protected them became difficult to reproduce. Removing a body from frozen ground exposed it to warmer air, changing humidity, light, vibration, microorganisms, and the possibility of rapid deterioration. Conservators therefore had to maintain controlled cold conditions and limit environmental fluctuation. Display could not be treated as ordinary museum presentation, because a small rise in temperature or moisture might encourage thawing, cracking, mold, or chemical damage. The bodies require continuous monitoring, specialized containers, filtered light, and careful control of air and humidity. This dependence reveals that their preservation remains active rather than complete. The mountain protected them only while its conditions remained stable, and modern technology now has to continue some of that work. Even scientific examination carries risk. Sampling hair or tissue removes material that cannot be replaced. Imaging must be planned to avoid unnecessary handling, and public display must be weighed against respect, conservation, and the wishes of communities connected to the Andean past. This distinction also prevents a scientific description from becoming a spectacle, since cracks, discoloration, lightning damage, dehydration, and fragile organs are not flaws in an exhibit. They are evidence of natural processes acting on children whose bodies were never meant to become permanent objects for observation. The phrase, perfectly preserved, may attract attention, but a more truthful description is exceptionally preserved, because it honors both the remarkable survival and the irreversible loss. The children reach the present with enough physical detail to teach us about diet, health, ritual, clothing, and burial. Yet they also arrived, altered, vulnerable, and incomplete. Their condition is extraordinary, not because time failed to touch them, but because time touched them so slowly that the evidence of 3 young lives remained visible. Studying the Llullaillaco children creates a difficult responsibility, because every new question must be balanced against the fact that the bodies and objects cannot be replaced once damaged. Early archaeology often depended on opening, cutting, removing, or sampling material, but modern research can learn much more by looking through the body rather than physically disassembling it. X-rays reveal bones, teeth, joints, and some foreign materials without requiring an incision, allowing researchers to examine growth, posture, old injury, and the way the body was arranged inside clothing. Computed tomography goes further by producing many thin images that can be combined into a 3-dimensional view, showing internal organs, airways, soft tissues, and relationships hidden beneath the skin. These methods helped confirm that the children retained structures usually lost after death, while also revealing differences among the maiden, the boy, and the Lightning Girl. Imaging can identify a fracture, an unusual density, a displaced organ, or damage caused after burial, yet every image still requires interpretation. A dark area on a scan does not automatically explain death, and a body altered by freezing, drying, pressure, or lightning cannot be read exactly like a living patient. Medical knowledge must therefore be adapted to archaeological conditions, with specialists comparing radiology, physical examination, burial context, and the known effects of long preservation. Photography also serves as a protective tool. Detailed images record clothing, hair, pigment, cords, and the position of offerings before anything is moved, allowing later researchers to return to the original arrangement without repeatedly handling fragile materials. Digital models can preserve shape and spatial relationships, while microscopes can examine fibers, hair surfaces, or small deposits using only limited contact. The human beginning of this work remains essential, because the purpose of technology is not to penetrate every boundary simply because it can. The children were once living individuals, not containers of information, and their unusual preservation does not remove the need for restraint. Some questions require physical samples. Hair can be divided to examine diet and ritual substances. Tiny amounts of tissue may reveal disease or biological condition, and fibers can identify materials or methods of production, but every sample permanently reduces what remains. Researchers must therefore ask whether the expected knowledge is important enough, whether a smaller sample can answer the question, and whether an imaging method could provide useful evidence without destruction. Conservation also affects every decision. Opening a container, changing temperature, exposing a body to light, or transporting it for scanning may create risks even when no tissue is removed. Equipment and procedures must be arranged around the needs of preservation, rather than forcing the children into ordinary clinical routines. Careful study depends on cooperation among archaeologists. Physicians, conservators, chemists, textile specialists, and people responsible for cultural and ethical oversight. No single discipline can explain the bodies alone. Radiology may show anatomy, chemistry may record substances, textiles may reveal labor and status, and archaeology may preserve the order connecting all of them. When these forms of evidence agree, confidence grows. When they conflict, uncertainty must remain visible. Looking without destroying does not mean learning without limits. It means accepting that some questions should remain unanswered, rather than consuming the evidence that future generations may study with better methods. Temperature records, sealed display systems, and repeated visual checks allow conservators to notice small changes before they become irreversible. Comparison over time can reveal new cracking, movement, discoloration, or moisture. And these observations may be more valuable than another invasive test. Preservation is therefore a form of research itself, because maintaining stability keeps future evidence available and prevents present curiosity from becoming permanent loss. The most respectful science is therefore not the one that extracts the greatest amount of data immediately, but the one that gains necessary knowledge while preserving the children, their clothing, and their silent context for people who have not yet had the chance to ask different questions. Reconstructing the lives of the Llullaillaco children requires combining many small forms of evidence without allowing any one result to become a complete story. Age can be estimated from teeth, bone growth, and the development of the skeleton, but even careful estimates remain ranges rather than exact birthdays. The maiden was an adolescent, while the boy and the lightning girl were younger, yet no scientific method can recover the names by which their families knew them, or the particular year in which each life began. Bones and teeth can reveal patterns of growth, periods of stress, injury, or illness. Preserved organs may show signs of disease, and hair can record changes in diet and ritual substances over time. Clothing and ornaments can indicate careful preparation, access to skilled labor, and connection to ceremonial status. While the arrangement of each burial shows that the children were deliberately placed within a planned state ritual, these pieces are strongest when they support one another. A shift in hair chemistry becomes more meaningful when it is considered beside valued foods, formal garments, and historical descriptions of preparation for Capacocha. But agreement among several sources still does not produce a private biography. A richer diet does not reveal whether a child felt honored, frightened, confused, or comforted. A carefully braided hairstyle does not identify the person who arranged it, and a preserved expression cannot tell us what the child understood. Reconstructing movement is equally limited. Isotopic evidence may suggest that a person consumed foods associated with different environments or social conditions, and objects can show links across distant regions, but these traces do not create an exact map of every road, village, or resting place. The wider road system makes organized travel possible to explain, yet the route of each child remains partly unknown. The human beginning of the evidence should guide every interpretation. Before they became the center of an imperial ceremony, the children had bodies shaped by years of dependence on households and communities. Their growth records meals given by others, their teeth record childhood development, and their clothing records the labor of people who spun, wove, dyed, fastened, and carried materials. Science can recover some of these relationships in general form, but it cannot identify every caregiver, every artisan, or every decision that changed the course of their lives. Even evidence of health must be treated carefully. Preserved tissue can reveal a condition present near death, yet presence does not always mean severe illness. An absence of visible disease does not prove that a child was free from pain or weakness. Extreme altitude could affect each body differently, while freezing and centuries of preservation may alter signs that modern physicians would normally read in living patients. Comparisons with other high mountain burials can reveal repeated ceremonial patterns, but similarity should not erase local differences, because each site was shaped by its own mountain, community, date, offerings, and political circumstances. A pattern helps identify Capacocha. While the individual burial still requires its own careful reading, the same restraint applies to cause of death. Deliberate sacrifice is established by the burial context, but the exact biological sequence may involve cold, reduced oxygen, alcohol, restraint, or other factors in combinations that differed among the three. A truthful reconstruction therefore remains layered. It can describe the society, the ceremonial preparation, the physical journey, the state of the bodies, and the limits of the evidence without inventing dialogue, motives, or final thoughts. This approach may feel less complete than a dramatic narrative, but it preserves something more valuable: the distinction between what the children still reveal and what was lost with their voices. Their story becomes clearer not when uncertainty is removed, but when every claim is placed beside the evidence strong enough to support it, leaving the unknown parts visible rather than filling them with the needs of the present, or with certainty that never existed. The discovery of the Llullaillaco children created knowledge, but it also created a lasting ethical responsibility, because the bodies are not ordinary objects and their value cannot be measured only by what science can extract from them. They were children whose lives ended within a ceremony organized by adults, and their preservation now places them before institutions, researchers, visitors, and communities that must decide how they should be studied and remembered. Every examination can deepen understanding of Inca history, diet, disease, ritual, clothing, and high-altitude preservation. Yet every examination also risks turning a person into a source of data. The same tension appears in public display. Seeing a preserved face can make history immediate in a way that bones or photographs may not, but that immediacy can educate, or it can become spectacle, depending on how the body is presented, explained, and protected. A respectful display avoids dramatic lighting, sensational language, and claims that invite curiosity without context. It explains that the children belong to living communities, that their deaths occurred within Capacocha, that scientific conclusions remain limited, and that preservation does not erase their dignity. The museum responsible for them has used specially controlled conditions and has displayed the children selectively, rather than treating all three as permanent attractions. Conservation requires cold, stable humidity, filtered light, and careful monitoring. So, ethical responsibility and physical preservation often support the same decision. Fewer exposures and less handling protect both the remains and the meaning surrounding them. However, technical care alone is not enough. The children also belong within the cultural history of Andean peoples, including communities that may view human remains, sacred mountains, and ancestral relationships differently from scientific institutions. No single modern group can easily speak for every community connected to the vast former Inca world. Yet, consultation, humility, and openness remain necessary. Researchers must recognize that legal possession does not automatically settle moral questions, and that the ability to study or display a body does not by itself create the right to do so without limits. The human beginning of the story should guide these choices. Before becoming archaeological evidence, each child lived through dependence, care, language, family ties, and social belonging. The body now held in a museum was once known through relationships that science cannot recover. This missing world should restrain the desire to make every tissue visible or every question answerable. Destructive sampling deserves special caution, because a strand of hair, fragment of textile, or piece of tissue cannot be returned after analysis. A test may provide valuable information, but the benefit should be weighed against permanent loss. Methods should use the smallest possible amount, avoid repetition, and preserve material for future techniques that may learn more with less damage. Visitors also carry responsibility. They should not be encouraged to treat the children as proof of a mysterious or savage past, because such language reduces a complex society to one painful practice and separates modern viewers from the human capacity for belief, obedience, care, and harm. The ethical lesson is not that the Inca were uniquely cruel, nor that ritual meaning excuses the deaths. It is that societies can surround vulnerable people with honor and still deny them control over their lives. Displaying the children can therefore have educational value when it reveals both cultural complexity and unequal power. While refusing to transform suffering into entertainment, the final measure of responsible study is not how much attention the bodies attract, but whether knowledge is gained without erasing the children again, first through sacrifice and then through the gaze of the living. Their continued care should therefore include transparent research standards, limited access, careful explanation, meaningful consultation, and the willingness to leave some questions unanswered, because respect is shown not only through what is discovered, but also through what people choose not to disturb, expose, repeat, or claim as their own before those children's silent presence. 5 centuries after the 3 children were taken to Llullaillaco, the central question can be answered only with care. They were sacrificed as part of the Inca ceremony known as Capacocha, a state-supported ritual in which selected children and valuable offerings were carried to sacred places during moments of major political or religious importance. The mountain burials, the formal clothing, the miniature figures, the food, the vessels, the prepared chambers, and the long process recorded in hair all support this identification. Yet the reason for this particular ceremony cannot be reduced to one event that is known with certainty. No surviving record names the children. No document states which ruler ordered their journey, and no witness explains which crisis, transition, request, or obligation brought them to this summit. Colonial accounts describe Capacocha in connection with events such as the death or accession of a ruler, military change, natural danger, public need, or appeals concerning water and harvests. But these general descriptions do not prove which purpose applied at Llullaillaco. The most reliable conclusion is broader. The children were chosen because Inca society assigned exceptional ritual value to youth, purity, beauty, social position, and the giving of something that could not be replaced. Their sacrifice joined the authority of Tawantinsuyu, with a mountain understood as powerful within the sacred geography of the Andes. The ceremony also linked distant communities to the imperial center through roads, labor, food, textiles, metals, shells, officials, specialists, and families. Every object placed beside the children carried the work of people from the living world below, while the children themselves became the most irreversible offerings in the arrangement. This is where the cold logic of the ritual becomes visible. They were not selected because they were considered worthless. They were selected because adults and institutions considered them valuable enough to stand between society and forces believed to shape life, weather, fertility, political order, ancestry, and the future of communities. Ceremonial honor, however, did not give the children equal power within the decision. Their improved diet, formal clothing, careful grooming, and use of coca and alcohol show preparation and attention. but none proves understanding or consent. The society that elevated their ritual status also controlled their movement, food, destination, and final exposure to the mountain. This answer must therefore hold belief and power together. Capacocha was neither only religion nor only political control. It was a ceremony in which sacred obligation, imperial organization, local landscapes, family relationships, and unequal authority became inseparable. The three children reached the summit because many people accepted, obeyed, negotiated, or enforced a system that made such a journey meaningful. Although the exact balance among faith, duty, pressure, grief, and honor cannot be recovered, their deaths were not an accident caused by altitude, and their preservation was not the purpose that can be proven. Human decisions brought them into prepared chambers, while cold, dryness, and thin air shaped the biological end and preserved its evidence. The phrase "sacrificed 500 years ago" points toward a real event, but it should not hide the complexity behind it. These were three different children, drawn from lives that began in communities, transformed through a long ceremonial process, and placed on a mountain where the Inca state tried to address a world larger than any one person. Their bodies survived because nature slowed decay, but the reason they were there began with a human order that valued continuity, authority, and sacred exchange more than the futures of the children chosen to carry that meaning. Understanding this does not excuse the sacrifice, nor does it require judging an entire civilization through one practice. It asks us to see how a highly organized society could combine care, beauty, faith, and violence within the same solemn act, while leaving the final motives partly beyond recovery. The story of the Llullaillaco children carries an educational value that reaches beyond the details of one ceremony, because it shows how human societies can create systems in which care and harm exist beside each other, without appearing contradictory to those who live within them. The children were fed carefully, dressed in fine textiles, adorned with valuable objects, and placed at the center of a solemn ritual. Yet the same process removed them from their families, directed their movements, and ended the futures they might have carried into another generation. This tension should not be simplified into the claim that the Inca lacked love for children or failed to understand death. Nor should sacred meaning be used to soften the fact that three young lives were taken by decisions made by adults. The more difficult lesson is that people can believe they are protecting a community while accepting suffering from those with the least power. Institutions can surround an action with beauty, authority, tradition, and reverence, until its human cost becomes harder to see. This pattern is not unique to Tawantinsuyu. Although the form it took on Llullaillaco belonged to a specific Andean world, throughout history communities have asked individuals to bear risks in the name of order, survival, faith, honor, or the future. Understanding that pattern does not erase cultural difference. It helps explain why moral reflection must remain active even inside respected traditions. The three children also teach the value of evidence. Their bodies, hair, clothing, food, and burial chambers allow researchers to reconstruct elements of the process that brought them to the mountain, but the unknown areas remain just as important. No method can recover their private thoughts, the words spoken by their families, or the exact balance of belief, pressure, grief, and obedience around the ceremony. Accepting these limits is a form of honesty, because history becomes misleading when silence is filled with confident invention. The educational value, therefore, lies not only in what science discovers, but in learning how to distinguish knowledge from possibility and possibility from imagination. The mountain preserved enough to show that the children were selected, prepared, transported, and deliberately placed, while leaving the most personal dimensions beyond reach. This incomplete survival encourages a more careful way of looking at the past, one that neither condemns an entire civilization through a single practice, nor hides suffering behind admiration for roads, textiles, architecture, and political organization. Tawantinsuyu created remarkable systems of agriculture, communication, engineering, and collective labor. And it also supported ceremonies in which vulnerable lives could become offerings. Both realities belong to the same history, and maturity begins when neither is removed to make the past easier to admire or reject. The children finally remind the living that knowledge creates responsibility, Their bodies have taught researchers about diet, health, ritual, preservation, and imperial power, but the ability to study them does not grant unlimited ownership over them. Respect requires restraint, careful conservation, truthful language, and a refusal to turn their faces into entertainment. This responsibility also belongs to listeners, because the way a story is repeated can either return dignity or remove it again. Sensational claims may attract attention, but they narrow 3 human lives into a brief moment of horror, while careful explanation restores the long world around them, the families, workers, roads, beliefs, foods, textiles, and institutions that shape the journey. Remembering them truthfully means allowing complexity to remain, admitting that admiration and sorrow can occupy the same history, and refusing to treat uncertainty as a weakness. The greatest value of their story may be the quiet recognition that every society must examine what it asks from those who cannot freely refuse. Because tradition can preserve wisdom, but tradition alone cannot decide whether suffering is just, and power can organize extraordinary achievements, but power must still be judged carefully by how it treats the most dependent lives within its reach. The mountain preserved the children with a closeness that time rarely allows. Yet the greatest absence around them is not physical. It is the silence left by everything their bodies could not carry into the present. Their faces remain visible. Their hair still records months of changing food and ritual preparation. Their clothing still holds the work of weavers and the authority of a society that placed meaning upon them. But no examination can recover the sound of their names, the tone of a parent speaking to them, the language used to explain the journey, or the thoughts that passed through their minds as the air became thinner and the inhabited world disappeared below. This silence is not a gap that history should fill with dramatic certainty. It is part of the evidence itself, a reminder that preservation can save tissue, while allowing identity to vanish. The maiden, the boy, and the lightning girl have become known through modern names because the names given at birth were lost, and that loss should remain visible whenever their story is told. They were not created for museums, research papers, or distant listeners. They began as children within households, dependent on food, warmth, affection, instruction, and protection. Their lives entered the historical record only because an institution redirected those ordinary human needs toward a ceremony whose purpose stood above their ability to refuse. 5 centuries later, the living inherit a different responsibility, not to repeat the authority of the past by claiming complete ownership over their bodies or meanings, but to study them carefully, preserve them respectfully, and speak honestly about what can and cannot be known. Their story teaches that advanced organization, skilled art, deep environmental knowledge, and powerful belief do not automatically protect the vulnerable. A society can build roads across mountains, manage resources across great distances, create textiles of extraordinary beauty, and still ask children to carry a burden chosen by adults. This does not make every person in that society cruel, nor does it make the ceremony harmless. It reveals something more difficult about human history. People can combine devotion with coercion, care with control, and reverence with irreversible loss. Understanding this complexity is not an excuse for the sacrifice. It is a way of recognizing the conditions that allow harmful acts to appear meaningful, necessary, or honorable. The children also show why history must remain humble. Science can identify diet, age, illness, altitude, ritual substances, burial order, and patterns shared with other Capacocha sites. Yet it cannot recover consent, private memory, or the final words spoken near the summit. When evidence ends, honesty must begin, and the unknown should not be treated as empty space available for invention. The educational value of Llullaillaco therefore lies as much in restraint as in discovery, in learning to look at a preserved face without imagining that the person has become fully accessible, in recognizing that a body can teach while still deserving privacy, and in remembering that knowledge gained from the dead creates obligations among the living. Each generation that studies them must decide whether new information justifies new disturbance, whether public display deepens understanding or merely satisfies curiosity, and whether language restores dignity or turns suffering into a spectacle. These choices belong to the present, not to the Inca past, and they reveal what modern societies value when confronted with vulnerable people who can no longer speak for themselves, and what duties remain after curiosity has been satisfied. The mountain kept the children from disappearing into the soil, but it could not return them to the families, futures, and generations they might have known. What remains is a physical presence suspended between history and memory, asking modern observers to decide whether they will approach the past as owners, spectators, or caretakers. And when science can preserve almost everything except their voices, how should the living choose to remember these three children?